Joining us now to discuss the meeting between Trump and Zelensky is Gordon Chang, political analyst and author of the book Plan Red, China's Project to Destroy America. Also joining us is Rod Martin, founder and CEO of Martin Capital and political analyst. So first of all, thank you both for being here. Gordon, let's get right into it. How consequential is this meeting with Zelensky?
The meeting is consequential because if the war in Ukraine ends with Russia annexing Ukrainian territory, then that opens the door to China. China will think that it can grab neighbors' territory and keep it, because if Russia can keep it, so can China. So really what we're talking about is perhaps the starting of another global war with China in East Asia or South Asia.
Gordon, what do you think China's stake in this is?
Well, China right now probably wants the war to continue. And we can gather that from what Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, on July. Wang Yi said that China does not want to see Russia lose because if Russia loses, then the United States will focus on China in East Asia. If you can extrapolate a little bit from that, even if Russia were to win in Ukraine, the war would end. And that would also allow the US to focus on China in its home territory. So I think China wants to see this war just to drag on indefinitely. And so therefore, it will keep the US tied down in Ukraine.
Okay, Rod, what is your perspective on this? How important is this meeting?
Well, it's extremely important, and for a variety of reasons, but the first and foremost is we have to get the Europeans on the same page with President Trump. This is a war that can be solved. This is absolutely a situation that can be resolved peacefully. And, Gordon's exactly right. The Chinese would love for this to drag on forever. And it benefits them to drag it on forever because it bleeds Russia out over time. There is at least the possibility here, based on what we've heard Donald Trump say, that a peace deal would include significant American investment into Russia, certainly into Ukraine, but into Russia also. That would be the sweetener. That's the carrot to go with the stick. If you do that, you at least lessen the supposed ties between Russia and China, which I would characterize as increasingly a Chinese colonization of Russia. Certainly they are treating them not as a friend, but as a dependent.
So Gordon, let me get your reaction to what Rod said. And as well, a large group of European leaders is joining this meeting, as Rod mentioned. What message is that sending in your view?
Well, it means that Europe is solidly behind Zelensky. They've had a number of conversations, including this morning, and I think they're trying to present a united front to President Trump. And, what Rod is saying is right. I mean, there's some possibility of trying to move Putin away from Xi Jinping. I think it's a lot more difficult than most people think, especially because Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping see the world in the same terms. And therefore, they have been coordinating their policies across the board for at least a decade. That makes life pretty difficult for the United States or anybody trying to pry Moscow away from Beijing. So I think really what we need to see is perhaps a different approach, something that actually gets the war over and gets the war over on terms that doesn't open the door to war in East Asia.
Okay, Rod, so what do you think? What is the path here where you end the war, but China doesn't benefit, and it sort of benefits Ukraine as well without rewarding Russia?
Just ending the war does tremendous harm to China. Every day that this war continues is a day that they are buying a crazy amount of Russian oil very, very cheaply. They're demanding that payment in yuan or in gold. So they're just draining the Russian treasury every day. And the longer Russian troops die, the weaker Russia becomes, and the more susceptible Siberia is to becoming a Chinese sphere of influence. So just ending the war is a huge benefit. Now, do you want to reward aggression? Of course not. Do you want to reward conquest? Certainly not. But at the same time, that ship already sailed with regard to the Donbass and Crimea. Thank you, Barack Obama, as usual. And so there may be a compromise that is acceptable that creates something like the status quo ante that nevertheless provides Ukraine some meaningful security guarantees. And I would just suggest that that's the biggest single takeaway from Anchorage, that Putin actually gave way on Western security guarantees, particularly U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine. We've never heard that from him before.
Okay, Gordon, what do you think about the security guarantees here?
Well, obviously, they're going to be necessary. The U.S. Did give security guarantees in 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum, and obviously that wasn't enough. So we're going to have to do something a little bit different. And I would think that you'd have a ceasefire. Ukraine doesn't have to recognize Russian annexation of its territory. And the United States can impose severe costs on anybody buying Russian oil. No money for Putin means no war in Ukraine. So there are a lot of things that we can do. President Trump has a lot of leverage. He has a lot of tools. He hasn't used them yet. And I think that's because he believes that maybe there's a way to deal with this in a way which is diplomatic. But I'm not so sure that's the case, but we're going to find out very soon because events are coming to a head.
So, Rod, two things. Gordon saying that President Trump has a lot of tools, which he has yet to use them all. And that's one thing. What do you think about Trump's conditions, for example, like no NATO membership for Ukraine and potentially no return of Crimea? How do you feel about that?
Well, it's important when you sit down at a peace table that you recognize the other side has a point too. If Ukraine became a member of NATO, effectively you would be reversing the outcome of World War II. At least theoretically, a German army would be sitting in Kharkov, 350 miles across pretty even ground from Red Square. So that's just a red line for them in the same way that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a red line for us. But if you can paper around that, if you can give Ukraine meaningful security guarantees that actually do create a lasting peace without crossing certain red lines, I think there's a deal to be made here because, as Gordon says, the president has tons of tools available, not least of which a staggering ability to destroy the economies of Russia's purchasers. You take away their hard currency, and Russia withers on the vine, and it does so pretty quickly. And by the way, Donald Trump has taken a page straight out of Ronald Reagan's book there. Ronald Reagan made a deal with the Saudis in the mid-'80s to collapse the price of oil in a way that dried up Russian hard currency and was key to winning the Cold War. Donald Trump learned from that. We will see that stick if the carrot doesn't work.
So, Gordon, what do you think? How far should President Trump go? How much should he push for peace here?
At this point, I think the Chinese and the Russians believe that the future of the world gets written on the fields of Ukraine. And so we should take our position and take the hint. And that's important because it's what our enemies think. And what our enemies think doesn't necessarily be true, but in a very large measure it is, because that's what's going to impel them to act. And so we've got to understand where they see this and how they see it and act accordingly.
Okay, Rod, President Trump has previously said that Zelensky doesn't have the cards, right? You remember that from the previous meeting. What leverage do you think Zelensky has in today's negotiations?
Zelensky has almost no cards. Donald Trump is correct about that. Donald Trump, however, has enough cards to crush the Russian economy and with it dramatically harm the Indian economy, significantly harm the Chinese. So there's a lot of reason for both China and India, and to a lesser degree, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, to put a ton of pressure on Vladimir Putin to actually make a reasonable deal. And I think that's why he came to Anchorage. You don't come and have that meeting with Donald Trump and make such a real concession in terms of the security guarantees if you're winning.
So, Gordon, what does an optimistic deal look like to you? What does a decent outcome look like?
The outcome is a ceasefire and no formal recognition of annexation. Remember, we didn't recognize Russia's or the Soviet Union's annexation of the three Baltic states. And it took decades, but eventually those states ended up as independent. And I think we could end up with maybe the same thing here if President Trump uses all that leverage. This ain't going to be easy, as everybody has said. But given the importance, I think that we should be using the tools that we have because, as our enemies say, this is where the future is going to be designed. And so we've got to take that into account.
Okay, I think we can wrap up this conversation. But Rod, if you have any final thoughts here.
I would just say that we're at a very hopeful moment here, and it's because the president has acted with strength. He hasn't done everything he can do yet. He hasn't fired off all his ammunition at once, but he has positioned America as the leader of the world. He has dramatically changed the frame with China, and Russia is in serious trouble.
Well, all right. Thank you both for your time today. Rod, Gordon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.